The laminated sheet felt cheap between my fingers, like something you'd find taped to a gas station bathroom mirror. 6 rules typed in Comic Sans font, which should have been my first clue that this job was going to be weird. "These are jokes, right?" I asked April, but she'd already disappeared into the back office with her clipboard and coffee mug. Through the pass-through window, I could see her settling in at a desk covered with paperwork that definitely wasn't shift schedules or supplier invoices. I read the rules again while wiping down tables that didn't need wiping. Turn off all lights at 2 a.m. Lock the front door. Hide in the walk-in freezer until dawn. Don't answer the phone. Don't help anyone who asks to come inside. Prepare specific meals for specific customers who would arrive at exact times. What kind of diner closed in the middle of the night but stayed open? And why would anyone order food at 4 a.m. if they couldn't get inside? But I needed this job. My landlord had been leaving increasingly creative threats about overdue rent, and my truck was making sounds that my neighbor Gary said meant expensive problems soon. $500 a week to follow some eccentric rules? I'd done worse, for less. The diner itself seemed normal enough. Red vinyl booths with duct tape patches, black and white checkered floor that had seen better decades, and a grill that probably violated several health codes. The coffee maker gurgled like it was drowning, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with the persistence of mosquitoes. Standard small-town establishment where truckers grabbed coffee and locals gossiped over pie. I'd worked places like this before. The owners always had quirks. No whistling in the kitchen. Never serve coffee in the blue cups. Don't mention the mayor's wife. Rich people called it local character. Poor people called it putting up with crazy to pay rent. Around 1:30 a.m., April emerged from the office and grabbed her purse. "Remember, stick to the rules exactly. No exceptions, no improvising. Some traditions exist for good reasons. What happens if I don't follow them?" She paused at the door, her expression shifting to something that might have been sympathy. "You really don't want to find out." Then she was gone, leaving me alone with the hum of refrigeration units and the distant sound of trucks on Highway 9. At exactly 2 a.m., the knocking started. Not polite customer knocking. Heavy, rhythmic pounding that made the front windows rattle in their frames, like someone was using their fists, or maybe their whole body, trying to break through. I stood behind the counter, rules in hand, and realized my mouth had gone completely dry. This wasn't some quirky local custom. This was something else entirely. The knocking grew more violent. Bang, 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 systematic and relentless, like a machine designed to break things. I flipped the open sign to closed and started turning off lights, my hands shaking so badly I missed the first switch twice. The scratching began as I killed the last fluorescent, long, deliberate scrapes against the metal door, like someone dragging fingernails or claws down the surface. The sound went straight through my ears and settled in my teeth. I ran for the walk-in freezer. The cold hit me like a wall, but I pulled the heavy door closed and hugged myself in the darkness among hanging sides of beef and cases of frozen vegetables. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Through the insulated walls, I could still hear the scratching. Patient and persistent, like whatever was out there had all night and knew exactly what it was doing. At 3 a.m., the sound stopped. I waited another 5 minutes before cracking the freezer door, ready to slam it shut again if needed. The dining room was empty, but through the front windows, I could see a figure standing under the parking lot's single streetlight. A man in a white shirt, but the shirt was wrong. Torn and stained with dark patches that could have been dirt or blood or worse. He pressed his face against the glass, and even from across the room I could see his lips moving. "Please," his voice was muffled but desperate. "Please let me in. It's still out there. I can't. Please, I just need somewhere safe." Every instinct I had told me to unlock that door. He looked terrified, genuinely hurt, like someone who'd been running through the woods all night. His eyes were wide and darting, constantly checking over his shoulder. But the rules said don't help anyone who asks to come inside. "I know you can hear me. The man pressed harder against the glass. "I saw you turn off the lights. There's something in the woods, something that isn't... Please, I have kids. I just want to go home to my kids." My hand was halfway to the lock before I caught myself. The rules existed for good reasons, April had said. Maybe this was why. Maybe letting people in was how you ended up with bigger problems. I backed away from the windows and tried not to look at his face. At 3:15 a.m., the phone rang. I stared at it like it was a snake. 5 rings, 10, 15. The man in the white shirt was gone, but somehow that made everything worse. The phone kept ringing, shrill and insistent in the empty diner. My hand reached for it 3 separate times before I forced myself to step back. Don't answer the phone. No exceptions. After 27 rings, it stopped. At 3:30 a.m., something slid under the front door. A manila envelope, thick and official looking. My name was written on the front in neat handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper with instructions that made my stomach drop. To complete your first shift, remove your left pinky finger using the boning knife in the kitchen. Place the severed digit in the mason jar labeled Ken behind the coffee machine. Failure to comply will result in immediate termination of employment and other consequences. I read it 3 times, waiting for the punchline or the fine print that would make this make sense. But there was nothing else. Just those cold, clinical instructions and the growing certainty that whoever wrote them was completely serious. The boning knife was exactly where the note said it would be. Sharp and clean and waiting. The mason jar sat behind the coffee machine with my name written in the same neat handwriting. I held the knife and looked at my left hand. My pinky finger seemed smaller than usual, almost insignificant. Just a little piece of meat and bone that I probably wouldn't miss too much. People lost fingers in accidents all the time and got along fine. But this wasn't an accident. This was a choice. And what kind of person cuts off their own finger for a job? The kind of person who's been evicted twice and knows what it feels like to sleep in their truck during January. That's who. I laid my hand flat on the cutting board and positioned the knife. 3 deep breaths. Think about the rent. Think about groceries. Think about having a place to live and work that doesn't involve explaining gaps in your employment history. The knife was sharp enough that it went through cleanly. The pain came a second later, white hot and absolute, and I had to bite down on a kitchen towel to keep from screaming. Blood ran everywhere, more than I'd expected, but I managed to get the finger into the jar before I passed out or threw up or both. I wrapped my hand in dish towels and tried to stop shaking. The finger looked small and pale in the bottom of the jar, like something that belonged in a medical textbook instead of a diner. At 4:15 a.m., a man in a brown suit walked through the front door like it had never been locked. He was perfectly normal looking. Middle-aged, thinning hair, the kind of guy who sold insurance or managed a bank branch. He sat at the counter and smiled at me like nothing was wrong, like I wasn't standing there with blood-soaked towels wrapped around my hand. "I'll have a cheeseburger," he said politely. "Medium rare, no pickles, extra mustard. And could you make sure the fries are crispy?" I cooked with my right hand, trying not to drip blood on anything. The burger sizzled on the grill while I dropped frozen fries in oil that was probably too hot. But my depth perception was off, and everything felt surreal. He ate in silence, taking small, precise bites and wiping his mouth with a napkin after each one. When he finished, he left 5 $100 bills on the counter and walked back out through the door that should have been locked. I put the money in the back safe with shaking hands, not trusting myself to count it properly. At 5 a.m., I heard scratching at the back door. Not fingernails this time. Claws. Real ones, clicking against concrete as something circled the building. I looked through the kitchen window and saw it. A dog the size of a small horse, black as the space between stars, with eyes that reflected the security light like mirrors. It sat by the back steps and waited. I knew what it wanted. The rules had been specific about the 5 a.m. visitor. I pulled a thick steak from the freezer and cooked it rare. blood pooling on the plate. My left hand throbbed with every heartbeat, but I managed to get the food outside without passing out. The dog took the steak gently, almost politely, then disappeared into the tree line like it had never existed. At 6 a.m. sharp, April's car pulled into the parking lot. She walked in looking fresh and professional, like she'd spent the night getting a full 8 hours of sleep instead of leaving me alone to deal with whatever the hell this place really was. "How did it go?" she asked, then noticed the bloody towels. "Oh, good. You found the note. Most people take a few nights to work up the courage." She said it like she was commenting on the weather. "What is this place?" My voice came out hoarse and shaky. "It's a diner," April said, pulling out a clipboard. "And you're officially off the clock. Good work tonight, Ken. Same time tomorrow?" I looked at my bandaged hand, at the jar with my finger behind the coffee machine, at the woman who acted like mutilation was just another job requirement. I should have walked out, should have called the police or a lawyer or someone who could explain what I'd gotten myself into. Should have done anything except what I actually did. "Yeah," I heard myself say. "Same time tomorrow." April smiled and made a note on her clipboard. "Excellent. You're going to work out just fine here." I clocked out and walked to my truck, holding my injured hand against my chest. In the early morning light, the diner looked completely normal. Just another roadside restaurant getting ready for the breakfast rush. But I could still hear the scratching sounds. And I knew I'd be back tomorrow night, ready to follow whatever rules they gave me, because that's what people like me do. We take what we can get and try not to ask too many questions about the cost. The trailer felt like a different planet when I finally got home. Same peeling vinyl siding, same broken porch step that I kept meaning to fix, same everything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed some invisible line and couldn't get back. I sat at my kitchen table and unwrapped the bloody dish towels from my hand. The finger stump looked worse in daylight, raw and angry where I'd hacked through bone. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but every time I moved wrong, fresh red would seep through the makeshift bandage. What the hell had I done? I poured half a bottle of hydrogen peroxide over the wound and nearly passed out from the pain. Then I wrapped it in clean gauze and medical tape, trying to make it look less like a self-inflicted amputation and more like a work accident. Industrial kitchens were dangerous places. Accidents happened all the time. 3 hours of sleep did nothing. I kept jerking awake, hearing scratching sounds that turned out to be tree branches against the trailer's aluminum walls. By 8:30, I gave up and drove to the urgent care clinic on Main Street. Dr. Meyer looked exactly like every small-town doctor I'd ever met. Tired, efficient, and completely unsurprised by whatever walked through her door. She examined my hand with the same expression she probably used for identifying skin rashes. "Kitchen accident?" she asked, cleaning the wound with practiced movements. "Yeah, boning knife slipped." She nodded like this made perfect sense, even though we both knew you don't accidentally cut through an entire finger. But she didn't ask follow-up questions, just numbed the area and started stitching. "You'll want to keep it dry for the next week," she said, wrapping fresh bandages around the shortened digit. "Change the dressing daily. Come back if you see signs of infection." "How much do I owe you?" "Insurance?" "No." She quoted a price that made my stomach drop, but I paid it. Money I couldn't afford for an injury I'd given myself for a job that might not even be real. On the way out, she handed me a bottle of prescription painkillers. For the next few days. "And Ken?" I stopped at the door. "Yeah, some jobs aren't worth what they cost you." I wanted to ask what she meant, but her expression had already closed off. Small-town doctors probably saw a lot of things they didn't talk about. The Piggly Wiggly sat next to a Subway and a store that sold phone cases and lottery tickets. I needed groceries anyway, and normalcy sounded good after the night I'd had. Push a cart around, buy some milk and sandwich meat, pretend I was a regular person with regular problems. The cashier was a woman in her 40s with auburn hair and kind eyes. Her name tag read, "Kara, 12 years, and she smiled like she actually meant it. Find everything okay, honey? Yeah, thanks. I loaded my groceries onto the conveyor belt, trying to keep my bandaged hand out of sight. Haven't seen you around before. You new in town? Just got a job at Mel's Diner. Night shift. The smile disappeared from her face. She stopped scanning my items and looked at me like I'd just told her I had cancer. Mel's? The place out on Highway 9? That's the one. Kara glanced around the store, then leaned closer. Honey, that place has been closed for 5 years, ever since Paul Wells disappeared. My chest tightened. What do you mean closed? I mean abandoned, boarded up. The health department condemned it after. She shook her head. 3 people worked there during the last year it was open. Paul Wells, the night manager, Jenny Morrison, day shift, and some college kid whose name I can't remember. All 3 of them just vanished. Paul's truck was found in the parking lot with the keys still in it, but no sign of him anywhere. The world felt like it was tilting sideways. That's not right. I was just there last night. There's a woman named April running the place. Kara's face went pale. No, sweetie. Nobody's run that place since Paul disappeared. The building's been empty. Hell, the power company disconnected the electricity years ago. But I worked there. I have a paycheck coming. She reached across the counter and grabbed my good hand. Listen to me very carefully. I don't know who you talked to or what they told you, but people who get involved with that place don't last long. Promise me you won't go back there. I pulled my hand away, my head spinning. You're wrong. I was there. I cooked food and cleaned tables and what happened to your finger? I looked down at my bandaged hand. Kitchen accident. Kara's expression said she knew exactly what kind of accident it had been. Promise me, she said again. I paid for my groceries and left without promising anything. The drive back to the diner took 20 minutes that felt like hours. I kept telling myself that Kara was mistaken, or that she was thinking of a different restaurant. Small towns had gossip networks that turned minor incidents into local legends. Maybe someone had quit suddenly, and the story had grown in the telling. But when I pulled into the parking lot, there was April's car sitting right where it had been that morning. The diner looked completely normal in the afternoon sunlight. Clean windows, fresh paint on the sign, and through the glass I could see April wiping down tables with a yellow rag. She waved when she saw my truck. Ken, how's the hand feeling? I walked inside, looking for any sign that this place had been abandoned for 5 years. The floors were clean, the equipment looked functional, and the coffee machine was gurgling away like it had been doing for decades. Kara Brennan says this place has been closed since 2018. April's expression tightened. Kara says a lot of things. She's had a grudge against this place ever since we stopped buying our produce from her brother-in-law's farm. She says 3 employees disappeared. Paul Wells quit after having some kind of breakdown. Started telling people the place was haunted, trying to scare away customers. Jenny Morrison moved to Little Rock for a better job. The college kid dropped out and went back home to his parents. April set down her rag and faced me directly. Small towns love their conspiracy theories, Ken. Especially when it involves someone they think got above their station. She walked to the office and came back with a folder full of papers. Employment records, supplier invoices, health department certificates, all dated within the last 2 years. I've been running this place since 2021. Bought it from the previous owner after Paul's little episode scared away the customers. It took me 6 months to convince people it was safe to eat here again. The documents looked legitimate. Detailed receipts from food distributors, payroll records showing April as manager, even a business license with her name on it. Paul Wells spread a lot of stories before he left, April continued. Said the rules were some kind of supernatural protection instead of basic security protocols. Claimed he'd seen monsters in the parking lot. The man clearly needed help, but instead of getting it, he just disappeared one night. Left behind a lot of confused, scared people who still believe his conspiracy theories. A quiet voice spoke from the kitchen doorway. Some jobs require sacrifices. I turned to see a man in his 30s, African American, wearing a black polo shirt and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He had the build of someone who stayed in shape, but the posture of someone carrying weight that had nothing to do with muscle. "Ken, this is Gavin Conway. He works the day shift." Gavin nodded but didn't make eye contact. "Been here 8 months. It's a job." "Gavin," Ken was asking about the rules. Something flickered across Gavin's face. Fear or guilt or both. "Rules are rules. You follow them or you don't work here." "But what happens if you don't follow them?" Gavin finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my newly shortened finger throb. "You really want to find out?" He disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving me standing between April's rational explanations and the growing certainty that everyone around here knew something I didn't. "Look," April said, "I understand this is all confusing. Paul's story's got a lot of people worked up, and when someone like Kara has known you since you were born, she feels responsible for protecting you. But the fact is, this is just a diner. We serve food, we clean tables, and we follow some basic security procedures to keep the place safe at night." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe that everything from last night had some rational explanation, that the knocking was just wind, the scratching was tree branches, and cutting off my finger had been some kind of stress-induced breakdown. But I could still hear that man outside the window, begging to be let in. Could still feel the weight of the knife in my hand and the certainty that what I was doing was necessary. "I need to think about this," I said. April smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. It's a lot to process. But Ken, don't let other people's fears make decisions for you. You were there last night. You know what really happened. That was the problem. I had no idea what really happened. I only knew that nothing had felt normal since I'd walked through that door, and everyone who tried to explain it sounded like they were lying. I drove home with more questions than answers, and the growing suspicion that my second night shift was going to be even worse than the first. I sat in my truck outside the diner for 10 minutes, engine running, telling myself I could still back out, drive home, call April in the morning, make up some excuse about a family emergency or sudden illness. People quit jobs all the time without working a second shift. But Kara's words kept echoing in my head. People who get involved with that place don't last long. If she was right about the diner being closed for 5 years, then what the hell had I walked into last night? And if she was wrong, why did everyone in town seem to know something I didn't? I needed answers. Real ones this time. Not April's smooth explanations that sounded reasonable until you thought about them too hard. The diner looked exactly the same as it had that afternoon. Clean, well lit, normal. Through the windows, I could see April moving around inside. But something was different tonight. She kept pulling out her phone, checking it, putting it back. Her movement seemed jerky, rushed. I walked in at 1:30 a.m. to find her wiping down the same table 3 times in a row. "Ken, good, you're here." She barely looked up from her cloth. "How's the hand feeling?" "Fine." I held up my bandaged finger. "Doctor says it'll heal clean." "Excellent, that's excellent." Another phone check. "Listen, I need to go over a few things with you about tonight." But she didn't go over anything. Instead, she kept cleaning surfaces that were already spotless, while glancing at her phone every 30 seconds. When I asked about the schedule for tomorrow's deliveries, she gave me an answer about inventory management that had nothing to do with what I'd asked. At 1:45 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text that made her face go pale. "Ken, I'm really sorry, but I have to leave. Family emergency." She was already grabbing her purse and keys. "Just follow the rules like last night, okay? Same routine, same timing, same everything." "Wait, what kind of emergency?" "My sister's in the hospital." I need to drive to Little Rock right now." She paused at the door, her expression tight with something that looked more like fear than worry. "Remember what I said about not improvising. Some traditions exist for good reasons." Then she was gone, leaving me alone 15 minutes earlier than usual. I stood in the empty diner, listening to the fluorescent lights buzz and the coffee machine gurgle. April's sister. Right. Because people rushing to hospital emergencies always took time to remind their employees about workplace traditions. Something was happening tonight. Something April didn't want to be here for. I looked at the laminated rules sheet, reading those Comic Sans instructions one more time. Turn off the lights at 2 a.m. Lock the door. Hide in the freezer. Don't answer the phone. Don't help anyone. Last night I'd followed every rule exactly and nearly died from blood loss. Tonight I was going to see what happened when I didn't. At 2 a.m. the knocking started right on schedule. Heavy rhythmic pounding that shook the windows. But instead of running for the light switches, I stayed behind the counter and watched. Instead of locking the door and hiding, I walked closer to the front windows. Through the glass I could see a man stumbling across the parking lot. Not the mysterious figure from last night. This was someone young, maybe my age, wearing hiking clothes that were torn and bloody. He reached the door and started pounding with both fists. "Please, please, somebody help me." His voice was raw, desperate. "There's something in the woods. It killed my friends." This wasn't some supernatural entity. This was a person in trouble. Exactly the kind of situation any decent human being would respond to. I unlocked the front door. The man practically fell through the doorway, gasping and covered in what looked like real blood. His hiking shirt was shredded down the front and scratches covered his arms like he'd been running through thorns. "Oh God, thank you. Thank you so much." He collapsed into the nearest booth, shaking violently. "I thought I was going to die out there." "What happened?" I grabbed a clean towel and handed it to him. "Are you hurt bad?" "We were camping about 2 miles north of here. Me and 3 friends from college." He pressed the towel against a cut on his forehead. "Something came out of the trees around midnight. I've never seen anything like it." "What kind of something?" "I don't know. It was huge, black, moved wrong, like it was part animal and part..." He shook his head. "It doesn't matter. It killed them. All 3 of them. I only got away because I ran." I sat across from him in the booth, my mind racing. "What's your name?" Dennis Coleman." He looked up at me with eyes that were wide with shock. "We thought we were being smart, camping near the road instead of going deep into the wilderness, but there are things in these woods that aren't supposed to exist." The scratching sounds from last night suddenly made more sense. Maybe the rules weren't about keeping monsters out. Maybe they were about keeping witnesses in. "Dennis, I need you to listen to me carefully. This place isn't what it seems. The woman who runs it, April, she's been lying about something. And the rules they gave me..." I pulled out the laminated sheet and showed him. Dennis read through them, his expression shifting from confusion to something like recognition. "Wait. These sound like the protocols from those old psychology experiments. The ones where they tested how far people would go if an authority figure told them to." "What do you mean?" "I'm a psych major. We studied cases where researchers convinced subjects to do harmful things just by putting the instructions in official language and having someone in a lab coat give the orders." He looked at my bandaged hand. "What happened to your finger?" Before I could answer, movement outside caught my attention. The man in the dirty white shirt was back, stumbling through the parking lot with the same desperate expression I'd seen last night. But this time I could see the blood on his clothes wasn't just stains, it was fresh, running down his arms in dark streams. "There's another one," I whispered. Dennis followed my gaze and went completely still. "That's Mike. That's my friend, Mike." The man reached the window and pressed his face against the glass, just like last night. But instead of pleading to come in, he was mouthing something else. A warning. Don't trust her. I could read on his lips. It's a trap. At 3:15 a.m., the phone rang. I looked at Dennis, who nodded encouragement. This time, I answered. Hello? Static crackled on the line. Then a man's voice came through, urgent and scared. Ken? Ken Woods? Yeah. Who is this? Paul Wells. Listen to me very carefully. April isn't who she claims to be. The diner isn't what she told you. You're in serious danger. My blood turned cold. Kara said you disappeared. I had to disappear. April's people were going to kill me when I figured out what they were really doing. The connection was poor, cutting in and out. Ken, you have to get out of there, now. They're coming for you. Who's coming? April's team. This whole thing is an experiment. You're not an employee, you're a test subject. They've been measuring how far they can push people before. The line went dead. I stood holding the phone, staring at Dennis, who had gone pale again. What experiment? Dennis asked. Outside, I could hear engines, multiple vehicles approaching from different directions. Through the windows, I saw headlights cutting through the darkness surrounding the diner. No envelope slid under the door at 3:30 a.m. Instead, unmarked vans pulled into the parking lot from 3 directions, boxing us in completely. Dennis grabbed my arm. Ken, I think I need to tell you something about why I'm really here. Dennis looked at me with an expression I'd seen before. Guilt mixed with resignation, like someone about to confess to stealing lunch money. I'm not a hiker, he said quietly. I'm an actor. I was hired to be here tonight. The words hit me like cold water. What? This whole thing, the camping story, my friends being killed, showing up bloody and desperate, it's all fake. He gestured at his torn clothes and the blood on his arms. Special effects makeup. I got a call 3 days ago about a corporate training video. They said they needed someone who could portray trauma convincingly. I stared at him, my brain trying to catch up. You're working for April. I didn't know what it really was until tonight. They told me it was for a psychological research study about helping behavior. I was supposed to test whether you'd break protocol to assist someone in distress. Dennis wiped at a streak of fake blood on his forehead. But when I saw your finger, when I heard you talking about cutting it off because of some note. The front door opened with a mechanical click. April walked in, flanked by 3 men in dark tactical gear, all of them carrying equipment that looked nothing like restaurant supplies. Her earlier panic was completely gone, replaced by the kind of calm efficiency I'd seen in corporate training videos. Thank you, Dennis. You can clock out now. Dennis stood up from the booth, avoiding my eyes. Ken, I'm sorry. I really didn't know it would go this far. Go wait in van 2, April told him. Dennis walked out without looking back. I was alone with April and her team, who spread out through the diner like they owned the place, which apparently they did. So, I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. No family emergency. There never was. April pulled out a tablet and started tapping through screens. Ken, I want you to know that your performance over the last 2 nights has been exceptional. Your compliance rates are some of the highest we've recorded. Compliance rates. The willingness to follow arbitrary instructions under psychological stress. The speed of adaptation to impossible circumstances. Your capacity for self-harm when presented with authority-based demands. She showed me the tablet screen, which displayed a graph with my name at the top. We've been documenting everything. One of the tactical guys was setting up a camera on a tripod, pointed directly at where I stood behind the counter. Another was unpacking what looked like medical equipment. The supernatural stuff was fake, I said, pieces clicking into place. The knocking, the scratching, the man outside. Audio recordings and projected images. We have speakers hidden around the building perimeter and high-definition projectors that can create remarkably convincing apparitions. April sounded proud of the technical details. The man at the window was actually Dennis from last night, before tonight's scenario, We use multiple actors to maintain the illusion. And the thing that came through the locked door? Pneumatic locking system. The door was never actually secured from the inside. Marcus here can walk through it any time we want. She nodded toward one of the tactical guys, who I now recognized as the middle-aged man in the brown suit who'd ordered the cheeseburger. My missing finger was throbbing like it had its own heartbeat. The note telling me to cut off my finger. Standard compliance test. We needed to establish your willingness to cause yourself physical harm when instructed by perceived authority. April made another note on her tablet. The fact that you completed the task on the first night was remarkable. Most subjects require multiple attempts or refuse entirely. You made me mutilate myself for a research study. You chose to mutilate yourself. That's what makes the data so valuable. She looked up from her screen with the same expression she'd used to ask about my hand that morning. We've been studying supernatural folklore in rural communities for 18 months, documenting how urban legends affect behavior and decision-making. This location was perfect because of the local stories about mysterious disappearances. The third tactical guy was pulling equipment from a case, restraints that looked medical but felt military. What happened to Paul Wells? Paul was our previous long-term subject. Lasted 11 nights before he figured out what was happening and tried to expose the operation. April's voice didn't change at all. We had to relocate him. Relocate him where? That's not your concern. Gavin Conway walked through the front door, still wearing his black polo shirt, but now carrying a radio and what was definitely not restaurant equipment. The quiet, conflicted man from this afternoon was gone, replaced by someone who moved like security. Subject is contained, he said into his radio. No complications. I looked at Gavin, remembering how uncomfortable he'd seemed when I asked about the rules. You've been watching me. Day shift surveillance, yes. Making sure you didn't talk to the wrong people or ask questions in town. He wouldn't meet my eyes. It's just a job. A job watching someone you knew was being psychologically tortured. The pay is good, Gavin said, but his voice had no conviction. April closed her tablet and faced me directly. Ken, you have a choice to make. We're prepared to offer you a substantial compensation package to continue as a research subject. $15,000 for one more month of data collection. That's more money than you've probably seen in your entire life. I thought about my overdue rent, my broken truck, the endless cycle of temporary jobs that paid just enough to keep me alive, but never enough to get ahead. $15,000 would solve every immediate problem I had. What happens if I say no? Then you become a security concern, and we handle security concerns accordingly. The guy with the restraints took a step closer. Through the windows, I could see the vans positioned to block every exit. There was nowhere to run, even if I could get past the three guys who looked like they'd done this before. But something was wrong with their setup. All three of the tactical guys kept glancing toward the windows, and their confident expressions had shifted to something that looked like nervousness. April was checking her watch every few seconds, like she was waiting for something. From the forest beyond the parking lot, a sound drifted through the night that made everyone in the diner freeze. It was a howl, but not from any dog I'd ever heard. Too deep, too long, and with an undertone that seemed to vibrate through the building's walls. The tactical guys exchanged looks that had nothing to do with their current operation. What was that? I asked. April's professional composure cracked for just a second. Probably coyotes. They're common in this area. Another howl answered the first, then a third, then more until it sounded like a pack of something massive was surrounding the diner. The tactical guys were definitely nervous now, hands moving toward weapons that weren't supposed to be needed for this kind of work. Those don't sound like coyotes, Gavin said quietly. Through the front windows, I could see something moving between the trees. Not the projected images or fake effects April's team had been using. Something real, something big, something that made the van closest to the forest shake as it passed. April was frantically typing on her tablet, probably trying to contact whoever was supposed to be controlling tonight's effects. But her equipment wasn't responding, and the fear in her eyes was becoming impossible to hide. Whatever was out there in the woods wasn't part of the experiment. The howling was getting closer, and whatever was making those sounds was nothing like the audio recordings April's team had been using. This was raw, primal, and seemed to vibrate through the floor itself. "Equipment malfunction," April said into her radio, but only static answered. She tried her tablet again, swiping frantically through screens that were now frozen or displaying error messages. "Marcus, what's the status on the projection array?" Marcus pressed his earpiece, frowning. "No response from external units. All our gear just went dark." Through the windows, I could see the van's headlights flickering like dying flashlights. The steady hum of generators that I hadn't even noticed before was fading to silence. "That's not supposed to happen," Gavin muttered, backing away from the front door. The black shape I'd glimpsed between the trees emerged into the parking lot, and my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. It looked like a dog, but wrong in every possible way. Too big, the size of a small horse. Too dark, not just black fur, but like it absorbed light completely, and its eyes reflected the dying headlights like mirrors, casting twin beams back through the darkness. "Jesus," one of the tactical guys whispered. "What is that thing?" April was backing toward the kitchen, her professional mask completely gone. "It's not ours. This isn't part of the protocol." More shapes moved between the vans, not projections or actors in costumes, but things that moved with predatory grace and seemed to phase in and out of visibility. The remaining headlights went out one by one, plunging the parking lot into darkness, broken only by those reflecting eyes. "The basement," a voice said from behind me. I spun around to see a man standing in the kitchen doorway, not one of April's team. Tall, lean, with the kind of deep tan that came from years of outdoor work. He looked like he'd been living rough, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Paul Wells," I said. "Ken Woods. We need to go downstairs right now." He gestured toward what I'd thought was a supply closet. "All of you, unless you want to see what happens when the real rituals get skipped." April stared at him like he was a ghost. "You're supposed to be missing." "I've been right here the whole time, keeping these things fed and happy while you played your little games upstairs." Paul was already moving toward the closet, pulling open a door I'd never paid attention to. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Your fake schedule has been screwing with their routine for months. They're hungry and confused." Something scraped against the front windows. Not fingernails, but claws the size of kitchen knives. The glass didn't break, but it made a sound like a tuning fork being struck. "Move," Paul said. The tactical guys were tough enough to handle corporate espionage and psychological manipulation, but facing something that violated every law of physics was clearly outside their training. Marcus practically shoved April toward the basement stairs. The space below was bigger than it should have been, like the diner's footprint was somehow larger underground. Shelves lined the walls, filled with supplies that definitely weren't for cooking, jars of things I couldn't identify, bundles of dried herbs and tools that looked both ancient and well-maintained. "This is how it actually works," Paul said, pulling items from the shelves with practiced efficiency. "Every night at specific times, we provide specific things to specific entities. It's been the same routine for over 60 years. My grandfather started it, my father continued it, and I've been doing it since I was 21. "That's impossible," April said, but her voice had no conviction left. "You've been running psychological experiments in a place where the psychology doesn't matter because the monsters are real." Paul handed me a cloth bundle. "Your fake rules were close enough to the real ones that you accidentally kept some of the schedule going, but you missed the important parts." Above us, something heavy was moving across the diner floor. Not human footsteps, something that walked on 4 legs but was far too large to be any normal animal. The knocking at 2 a.m.? I asked. That's when the collector arrives. We turn off the lights and lock the door because it feeds on electrical energy and can't cross barriers it doesn't understand. The scratching sounds you heard were real. It was testing the building's defenses. Paul was mixing something in a metal bowl, ingredients that smelled like earth and copper. The man at the window isn't an actor. He's what's left of someone who broke the rules 20 years ago. He can't move on, can't die properly, just repeats the same warning every night. And the phone calls? Messages from people who tried to interfere with the process and got caught between dimensions. They're trying to warn whoever will listen, but they can only reach through at specific times when the barriers are thin. Gavin was staring at the shelves like he was seeing them for the first time. How long have you been down here? Since your boss started her little project, I had to disappear because she was disrupting everything, but I couldn't actually leave or these things would have torn the whole area apart looking for their regular meals. Paul finished mixing whatever was in the bowl and handed it to me. This goes outside at 5 a.m. exactly. The big one you saw in the parking lot will take it and go back to wherever it comes from for another month. The footsteps above stopped directly over our heads. What about my finger? I asked. Paul looked at my bandaged hand with something like pity. That was just April's test to see how far you'd go. It has nothing to do with the actual rules. He pulled out a handwritten notebook, pages yellowed with age and filled with careful cursive. These are the real protocols. 3 generations of my family figured out what works and what doesn't. April was reading over my shoulder, her scientific mind still trying to process what she was seeing. This is all documented. Dates, times, specific preparations. My grandfather was the first one to realize that this location sits on something like a crossroads. Things pass through here that don't belong in our world. But if you feed them regularly and respect their patterns, they don't bother anyone else. Paul took the notebook back. It's not magic or supernatural. It's just a job that needs doing. Above us, something else had entered the diner. Multiple somethings moving with purpose. They're looking for tonight's meal, Paul said. Your equipment probably tastes like the electrical energy they expect at 2 a.m., but it's not enough. They'll keep searching until they find what they need or until someone gives them the real thing. Marcus was checking his watch. How long until 5 a.m.? 43 minutes. Can we last that long down here? Paul was already heading for the stairs with the metal bowl. We're not staying down here. They need to see me to know the routine is back to normal. Ken, you're coming with me. What? You followed April's fake rules perfectly. You have the instincts for this work, and I need someone to take over when I can't do it anymore. He looked back at April's team. The rest of you can stay here until dawn. Then pack up your experiment and leave. I followed Paul up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. But for the first time in 2 days, I wasn't walking towards something unknown. Paul knew exactly what he was doing, and somehow that made all the difference. The diner above was full of shadows that moved independently of any light source. But as soon as Paul stepped into the main room, the movement stopped. Everything went perfectly still, like the whole building was holding its breath. It's me, Paul said to the darkness. I'm back. The shadows in the diner stopped moving the moment Paul spoke, not just paused. Completely frozen, like someone had hit a universal pause button. Even the air felt different, charged but calm. They recognize you, I said. 3 generations of my family have been feeding them on schedule. Paul moved toward the counter with the metal bowl, his movements deliberate but unhurried. To them, I smell like home. Through the windows, I could see the massive black dog thing sitting perfectly still in the parking lot, its mirror eyes fixed on Paul. Waiting. April emerged from the basement stairway, followed by her tactical team. Marcus had his hand near his weapon, but his body language screamed confusion rather than aggression. Gavin came up last, staring around the transformed diner like he was seeing it for the first time. How is this possible? April asked. Her tablet hung forgotten in her hands. Your people found this place through my missing person report, Paul said, checking the clock above the coffee machine. When I disappeared, the sheriff filed paperwork. Somehow that got flagged by whatever algorithm your employers use to find interesting psychological phenomena. The corporate research team identified this location based on local folklore patterns and law enforcement anomalies, Marcus said, his voice professionally steady despite everything. High concentration of unexplained disappearances, repeated witness reports of impossible events, local population exhibiting avoidance behaviors toward a specific geographic area. Paul nodded. Except you assumed the folklore was just stories affecting people's psychology. You never considered that the stories might be accurate. April was staring at the shadows that still hadn't moved. The supernatural manifestations we documented, the knocking, the apparitions, the impossible door mechanisms, those were all real? The knocking at 2 a.m. is the collector testing our defenses. The man at the window really is trapped between dimensions, and the door isn't pneumatic. It's a boundary that some things can cross when the conditions are right. Paul gestured toward the kitchen. Your fake setup was close enough to the real routine that you accidentally maintained some of the feeding schedule, but you missed the crucial parts. Like what? The personal connection. These things don't just want food or energy. They need to recognize who's providing it. They've been dealing with my family for 60 years. When I disappeared and strangers started running fake rituals, they got confused and hungry. Gavin was looking at his hands like he'd never seen them before. We've been interfering with some kind of supernatural ecosystem. Think of it more like a treaty, Paul said. Regular meals in exchange for leaving the surrounding area alone. Your corporate study broke the terms without understanding what you were disrupting. April pulled herself together enough to function in crisis mode. Our research protocols documented measurable psychological responses to perceived supernatural stimuli. We have 18 months of data showing what happens when you torture people while actual monsters watch from the woods, Paul interrupted. Ken lasted 2 nights of your fake rules because he has the temperament for the real work. Most people break under that kind of pressure. I looked at my bandaged hand. The finger was completely unnecessary. The finger was April testing how far she could push you. Paul's voice carried genuine anger. The real protocols don't require self-mutilation. They require precision, timing, and respect for things you don't fully understand. Marcus was checking his watch again. We have 37 minutes until 5 a.m., which is when the real feeding happens. Paul held up the metal bowl. The big one outside has been waiting all month for this specific meal, prepared this specific way, delivered by someone it trusts. April stepped closer, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. Can we document the process? Observe the exchange between... No. Paul's voice cut through her question like a blade. Your observation is what screwed up the balance in the first place. These entities don't perform for cameras or provide data for studies. They need routine, privacy, and respect. My employers invested significant resources in this research site. Your employers can find another way to study mass psychology. This location is off limits. April's professional training kicked in. I could see her switching to negotiation mode. Perhaps we could reach an arrangement, limited observation periods, non-intrusive monitoring equipment, shared research benefits. Lady, you made a guy cut his finger off for your fake study while real monsters were starving outside. You think I'm going to trust you with anything after that? The direct statement hit April like cold water. For a moment, her corporate composure cracked completely, and I saw something that might have been genuine shame. The psychological manipulation protocols were designed to test compliance under stress, she said quietly. We needed to establish baseline responses to authority in high-pressure situations. You needed to torture people to prove they'd follow orders when they were desperate enough, Paul replied. Ken took this job because he was facing eviction and his truck was broken. You exploited his financial desperation to see how much pain he'd inflict on himself. I was getting angry now. The kind of slow burn that builds when you realize how completely you've been used. You knew exactly why I couldn't quit. Demographics indicated high probability of compliance based on economic vulnerability and social isolation, April said, falling back into clinical language. Single adult male, aged out of foster care, no family support network, history of temporary employment. Jesus Christ, Gavin said. You're talking about him like he's a lab rat. All research requires control of variables, April said, but her voice had no conviction left. Paul was moving toward the front door with the metal bowl, and I followed him. What happens now? Now you learn how to do this right. He paused at the door, looking back at April's team. Your corporate friends need to pack up their equipment and leave. Tonight. The real entities are already agitated, and having strangers around will make the transition harder. Transition to what? I asked. You becoming the new night manager, guardian of the crossroads, whatever you want to call it. Paul opened the front door, and the massive black dog thing raised its head slightly. This job needs someone who can follow precise instructions under impossible circumstances, someone who won't break when the work gets strange. The night air smelled like ozone and something deeper, earth and metal and growing things. The dog thing's eyes tracked Paul's movement as he walked across the parking lot. I don't understand any of this, I said. You don't have to understand it. You just have to do it correctly. Paul stopped about 10 feet from the creature and set the bowl on the asphalt. My grandfather didn't understand it either when he started. Neither did my father. But the work needed doing, and our family was here. The massive dog approached the bowl with surprising delicacy, like it was approaching an altar. It lowered its head and began eating whatever Paul had prepared, making no sound except for careful, almost reverent feeding. Why me? Because you survived April's fake version without breaking completely. Because you followed arbitrary rules under extreme stress. Because you're here, and this job doesn't wait for perfect candidates. Paul watched the feeding with the satisfied expression of someone completing familiar work. And because you need something to do that matters. That last part hit deeper than I expected. All my temporary jobs, all the scrambling to pay rent and keep my truck running, none of it had ever felt like it mattered. Just survival, month after month, with no purpose beyond staying alive. What does the job actually involve? Feeding schedules, boundary maintenance, communication protocols with entities that don't think like humans. Learning which rules are flexible and which ones will get you killed if you mess them up. Paul gestured toward the creature, which was finishing its meal. Protecting the community from things they don't know exist, and protecting those things from people who would try to study or destroy them. The dog thing lifted its head from the empty bowl and looked directly at me. Its mirror eyes reflected my face back, distorted but recognizable. Then it picked up the bowl in its mouth, gently, carefully, and walked back toward the tree line. It knows you're taking over, Paul said. Behind us, April's team was loading equipment into their vans. I could hear Marcus coordinating the withdrawal, his voice carrying the professional efficiency of someone executing a strategic retreat. April approached us as the last van was loaded. This isn't over. My employers will want answers about 18 months of research and significant financial investment. Tell them they were studying a real phenomenon that requires management rather than documentation, Paul said. Tell them some things are too dangerous to monetize. And if they don't accept that explanation, Paul smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely dangerous. Then they can come discuss it with the night shift personally. April looked at me one last time. Ken, if you change your mind about this arrangement, the offer of legitimate employment remains open. Legitimate employment, I repeated, like cutting my finger off for research data. She had no answer for that. Within 10 minutes, all 3 vans were gone, leaving only Paul and me in the parking lot as dawn started lightening the eastern horizon. First lesson, Paul said, handing me a worn notebook. Real rules, written by people who figured out what works through trial and error over 60 years. I opened the notebook and saw pages of careful handwriting. Different pens, different hands, but all recording the same kinds of information. Times, procedures, observations about what worked and what didn't. Your grandfather started this? 1963. He was working construction on the original building and kept finding workers who'd show up for their shift talking about strange dreams or feeling like they'd lost time. He realized something was affecting people who spent too much time here after dark. Paul pointed toward the trees where the dog thing had disappeared. It took him 3 months to figure out the feeding schedule, another year to establish communication protocols with the entities that could talk. By the time he passed it down to my father, it was a complete system. And now you're passing it to me. Now I'm training you. Passing it down takes years of preparation. Paul looked at the lightening sky. But you showed aptitude under April's fake conditions, and the real work isn't actually harder, just different. I flipped through pages of the notebook, seeing entries dating back decades. Detailed observations about seasonal changes in entity behavior, modifications to feeding preparations that had proven more effective, warnings about mistakes that had led to dangerous situations. This is someone's entire life's work. 3 someone's. And now it's yours, if you want it. Paul started walking back toward the diner. The pay is $500 a week, same as April was offering, but you get it honestly. Plus housing. There's an apartment above the diner that goes with the job. What about during the day? Day shift is normal restaurant work. Breakfast, lunch, coffee for people heading to Little Rock. Nothing supernatural happens here between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Paul opened the front door. You'd be amazed how normal this place is most of the time. I followed him inside, looking around the diner with completely different eyes. And at night? At night, you follow the real rules and keep the peace between 2 worlds. Paul pulled a key ring from his pocket and handed it to me. It's not easy work, but it's important work, and it's yours if you want it. I took the keys, feeling their weight. Real responsibility, not April's fake authority. Purpose instead of just survival. I want it, I said. Paul smiled and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Then let's start with tonight's actual schedule.